In the month of October, I read 16 books, which I think is like a personal record for me. I normally read about 13 to 14 books, but October I was just on a reading binge. So here is my reading wrap up. I'm just going to quickly review the books, my thoughts, my feelings, my personal opinions. Of course, if you liked a book that I didn't like or vice versa, it's okay. This is a good community here. So I did start off the month with a 5-star read, and I do not give 5 stars out lightly. I'm very particular about books. I feel very passionate about books. And so to give a 5-star read, I was so excited. This is probably like my 5th 5-star read of the year, and I've read I think 140 books now. So like I said, for me, this was a big deal. And this book was called Beartown. This is by Fredrik Backman, and I've read some other Fredrik Backman books such as A Man Called Uva and Anxious People, and honestly I didn't like them. So this was kind of my last chance to try Fredrik Backman. I was like, all right man, you got one more chance. And I'm so glad that I took this chance because I loved this book. There are 2 more books in this series. It's a trilogy. So presently I am reading the 2nd book, so that'll be in my November wrap up, but let's talk about Beartown. So Beartown is about a factory town. It's very small, it's like a lumber town, and basically the main attraction of the town and what everyone is fixated on is the hockey team. So just hearing that doesn't sound like it was up my alley, but this book, like, it's so much more than just hockey. It's really about all the town people. It's about the emphasis that we place on young people and their success in sports. Also, like, do we believe someone because they're good at sports? Do we think that they're a better character because they're good at sports? It's kind of just like putting these athletes on a pedestal. Should we do that? Should we not do that? And I think that's something that we really struggle with in America, is we put these young men and women on this pedestal and we kind of act like we know them, or we make excuses for some of their bad behavior, etc. So it's kind of about that. I will say this book does start kind of slow. It's mostly about hockey for the first 150 pages, and at the 150 page mark it really takes a turn in a different direction. So keep that in mind if you're reading it, and just know that this book is just, man, it's beautiful. I would say look up trigger warnings though before you do read it. And if you like Tomorrow, Tomorrow, and Tomorrow, I think you'll really like this book. If you didn't really like Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, this is kind of in a similar vein in the writing, and that is very like lyrical and descriptive and more character driven. So I would skip it if you didn't like Tomorrow, Tomorrow, and Tomorrow, but if you did like it and you like that style, this will definitely be a good book for you. The 2nd book that I read was a Kindle Unlimited book. This is The Things We Leave Unfinished by Rebecca Yarros. And I gave this book 1.75 out of 5. I didn't really enjoy this. I was trying to give Rebecca Yarros another chance. I read Fourth Wing and I did not like Fourth Wing in the slightest. I know that Fourth Wing was Rebecca Yarros' first venture into fantasy, so I wanted to give her a chance in her romance genre, and I just don't really think I'm a fan of her in general, and that's fine. I mean, different strokes for different folks. So this one wasn't really for me. This was historical romance, so this had that past-present timeline, which personally, I think the past-present timeline in historical fiction is becoming very played out. I do like it in certain instances, but it seems like every single historical fiction book nowadays has a past-present timeline. So the general plot of this is in the present line. Our main character is Georgia. Georgia is the great-granddaughter of a romance writer named Scarlett, and Scarlett has just died. So Georgia is going to take over her estate, and Georgia's in charge of a book that Scarlett did not finish, and it's been basically like an autobiographical book that Scarlett just struggled to finish because it was really painful for her. So that's our present day storyline, and then our past storyline is about Scarlett and her love Jameson in World War II, and that's kind of what that unfinished book was about, and just kind of what happened in their relationship. So this book was really cheesy. Insta love is another theme, and I thought it was really repetitive. The twist at the end I saw coming pretty readily, and I just thought it was stupid and unnecessary, and I just didn't really like this. The third book is a second book in a trilogy. It is the Bill Hodges trilogy by Stephen King. So this was the second book in this trilogy. It was called Finders Keeper. If you are looking to read his newest book, Holly, I would recommend that you read Bill Hodges first and then also The Outsider. So this was the second book in that trilogy, and I gave this one a 3.25 out of 5. I liked Mr. Mercedes, which was the first book in the trilogy, much more. It was fast-paced, it was enjoyable, but it was just, I didn't really like the villain in this book as much. He just wasn't as enthralling, and then you didn't get to see as much as Bill Hodges and his little like detective trio as you did in the first one. So I think it was just kind of like lacking in that, but I think Stephen King paints a pretty good story. You do have to kind of suspend reality on how some of his characters talk. It's a little cringy, to be honest. Definitely not like horror gory like when you think of Stephen King. I think that's what a lot of people think of, but this was a detective novel. There's definitely still some grossities throughout, but definitely not like super disturbing. But this is about a man who is obsessed with an author. He kills the author and then he buries the treasure that he steals from the author, including the author's unpublished manuscripts. So that happened in the past, and then in present day a boy discovers those manuscripts and he becomes obsessed with the unpublished manuscripts, and meanwhile the killer is in jail for something else. He gets out, he tries to locate the manuscripts that he had buried, and from there like all hell ensues. So it was kind of like Misery in a way, and that there was that author obsession, but definitely not as gory and as psychological as Misery. If you guys have ever read Misery, Misery was a trip. If you haven't read it, definitely do recommend. So I like this, but definitely when it's Stephen King, it's definitely more of his new age stuff, just a lot lighter. The fourth book that I read was The 5-Star Weekend by Elin Hilderbrand. I gave this one a 2.5 out of 5. Elin Hilderbrand is so hit or miss for me, and I think part of the problem is that this was her most recent release, and if you guys do keep up with Elin Hilderbrand, she keeps saying that she's retiring from beach reads after her release next year, which will be the Swan Song, because she's just written kind of the same variation of the same story over and over. And so that's what I'm noticing. I've read probably 10 Elin Hilderbrand books, and I think they're fun, I think they're light, but they do become very repetitive after a while, and the characters do kind of like blend together. For me, this was just not one of her better novels. This is about a woman named Hollis who has a very popular food blog. Hollis's husband dies unexpectedly, and Hollis is kind of struggling to move on, and then she's also having to balance like all of her followers on the blog. So Hollis decides to try and move on and then also make her comeback on the internet with what she calls the 5-Star Weekend, which is where she plans a bunch of events around Nantucket with 5 of her friends from different points of her life. So like her high school best friend, her college best friend, a stranger, a best friend whenever her kids were young. So a lot of different women. And it was just really boring, to be honest, at certain points, and I just didn't think any of the characters were very likable. Her daughter wasn't very likable, Hollis wasn't very likable, Drew definitely wasn't likable. So I think it made it hard for you to root for anyone when you're like, all these people are trash. And then something I really just hate about Elin Hilderbrand's novel is that cheating is such a common trope. You see it, I think, in every single one of her novels, and it's very like blazing fair, like who cares? And to me, that's just gross. The 5th book I read was called The Way I Used to Be by Amber Smith. I do definitely recommend that you look up trigger warnings before going into this book, because it starts off on page 1 with a sexual assault scene. I ended up giving this one a 3.5 out of 5. This was a very conflicting read for me. So this is about our main character, Eden, who is also referred to as Edie throughout the novel. And on page 1, Edie is raped by her brother's best friend, Kevin, and that is during her freshman year of high school. We then follow Edie through freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior year, and just kind of how this rape that she's holding in, that she can't talk about, how it affects her, how it affects her relationships. And I think that the author did a really phenomenal job of showing how much this destroys you. This is something that happens that you don't just move on from, that you carry very close to the vest, that changes who you are as a person. So, you know, it's called The Way I Used to Be. So Edie used to be this very introverted, shy, not very popular girl who was very soft-spoken, and then after all this happened, she just had so much anger and she became a very different person. And multiple times throughout the book, she was just acted very out of character from how she used to act, and people, instead of saying like, what's wrong, people were like, why are you becoming such a bitch? Why are you so different than how you used to be? And they didn't really spot the signs. And I think that is very true, unfortunately, to life and to what happens to a lot of sexual assault victims. So I think the author did a really phenomenal job in portraying that side of it. But I think the pacing was really off on this book. A lot of the times, like, it would end in the middle of the school year, like, and then all of a sudden jump to the next school year, and there are a lot of things that were not fully explained. Like, for example, Edie starts calling her parents by their first names, but it just jumps to that with no explanation. And then there were also like some weird unnecessary high school stereotypes that I just think distracted from the overall message and story. For example, Edie and her friend, they were getting like things thrown at them in the cafeteria, even though they were the type of girls who like didn't seek attention, that kept their heads down. And I just don't think that that's really true to a high school experience. Like, a lot of the times, if you're really quiet and you're really like academic and you keep to yourself, I think a lot of people just leave you alone. But that's my experience. I think that this just kind of read as a first draft, and it just needed a little bit more editing and refinement, and I think then it would have been a 5 out of 5. The sixth book that I read was on Kindle Unlimited, and this is called If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. This is dark academia. I think this is one of my first dark academia books. I think my Dark Vanessa is considered dark academia, and if so, I really did like my Dark Vanessa. But If We Were Villains, I didn't really love. I gave this a 2.25 out of 5. This just was kind of boring and pretentious for me. I didn't really like all of the Shakespeare talk, so there's so much Shakespeare quotes and talk throughout, and I'm not a huge Shakespeare fan. I read Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet when I was in high school because they were required readings, and I was bored when I read them, so to have to constantly like read Shakespearean quotes in this was just a bit tiresome for me. So this centers around 7 thespians. They're seniors at an arts college, and they're just like a close group of friends because they're the only 7 that have made it in their department. Like, other actors have been weeded out throughout the years, so they're the 7 seniors who have made it, that are talented, so to speak. And it's basically, this book is divided in acts, so you get to watch what happens throughout their senior year, but you're also given glimpses into the present. All you know is that our main character, Oliver, has been arrested for something. So you see little glimpses at the beginning of each act of present day where a detective is talking to Oliver. Oliver's being released from a prison, so you just know something bad has gone down, and it was just boring. There's a twist at the end, which I thought was stupid. I think the whole concept of why Oliver was in prison was dumb. And then also you can guess a lot of things that happen. This book also suffered from very unlikable characters. Really the only character that I liked was Meredith, and then everyone else I could have done without. The 7th book that I read was a thriller. It was really fast paced. As with most thrillers, you do have to suspend reality. This book was called Behind the Red Door. This was by Megan Collins, and I gave this one a 3.5 out of 5. So basically, while watching the news with her husband, Fern sees a redheaded woman named Astrid has gone missing. Astrid had gone missing when she was a teenager as well, and now as an adult she's gone missing again. And Fern saying the story is like, that woman looks really familiar, and her husband's like, well, of course Astrid looks really familiar, her case was huge. Fern's like, no, I swear I didn't know anything about Astrid whenever she went missing as a teenager. And then Fern has to discover like why do I recognize this woman? So Fern returns to her hometown to help her dad pack up his house because he's going to be moving. And then it's there that she solves the mystery of her involvement in Fern's original disappearance, and then also what's happened to Fern or what's happened to Astrid in the present day. So it was really fast paced. The twists were very predictable, but I read this in like a day and a half, so there was something about this that was very captivating to me. Next up, we have another thriller. This one is on Kindle Unlimited. This is called Just Stay Away. This is by Tony Wirt. I gave this a 2.5 out of 5. So it's about a family that moves into a new neighborhood. The dad is an aspiring writer, and he's taking care of a 7-year-old daughter named Alice all summer long. The dad's just like very invested in his book and writing, and he almost sees his daughter Alice as like a nuisance, which is really frustrating throughout the book because Alice is not a bad kid in the slightest. She just like is a normal 7-year-old who's like, hey dad, like, is it cool if I get a snack? Is it okay if I watch a movie? So basically our main character sucks. He's a horrible dad. So Alice ends up meeting a neighborhood friend while she's playing outside named Levi. Levi is very weird and he's kind of creepy, and all of a sudden the original family's things start going missing whenever Alice plays with Levi. But despite all of these like blaring red flags, the dad's like, well, I don't know, Levi gets Alice out of my hair so I can write. So Alice, you keep on playing with Levi. So there's a lot of foreshadowing to what's going to happen and how Levi is going to mess with our main character, the dad, Craig, and it just got really ridiculous. And basically Craig just cared more about his book than his daughter's safety and his family's safety, so it just was too long and very frustrating, and I would just skip this one because Craig is a total dummy. Number 9 is The Boy and the Striped Pajamas by John Boyne, and I've heard about this book for years. I knew it was about World War II, but I didn't really know what it was about. I knew it was like structured as a kid's book, and I like reading World War II novels, so I wanted to give this one a read, and I'm really upset by this book. I ended up giving this book 1 out of 5 stars. I think that this book never should have been published. I think it's really offensive. Basically, this book is about a boy named Bruno. Bruno is like completely oblivious to the world around him. He has no idea that so much violence is going on around him, and Bruno's dad is in charge of Auschwitz, which he doesn't realize. And Bruno is very bored. They move to Auschwitz and he doesn't again realize what's going on. So Bruno one day is walking around. He meets up with another boy who is behind the Auschwitz fence and befriends that boy, and Bruno realizes that the boy is very sickly. He listens to the boy's story about how he's been away from his family, and I think this, I mean, it's just so historically inaccurate because there's no way that this could have happened. Bruno would have been a part of Hitler Youth if this really was accurate. He would have known about everything happening around him, and then it almost was like trying to make you sympathetic to Bruno and his family who are Nazis. So I don't really want to spend too much time on this because I just thought it was really a gross read. I think that it never should have been published, and I think it's really disgusting because it's marketed to children and they're going to be very confused about World War II and history if they do read this because it's so inaccurate, and it just seemed like it was trying to sympathize with Nazis, which is wrong. That's horrible. Moving on. Number 10, I read a memoir. This is called Admissions, a memoir of surviving boarding school. This is by Kendra James, and I gave this one a 2.75 out of 5. Memoirs are very hard to rate, and I don't always rate them, but for whatever reason, I did decide to give this one a rating. Nothing was really special about this book. It was about Kendra, who was the first black legacy at her boarding school. Taft, her dad, was like one of the first black students ever there, and then she was the first legacy at Taft, and just kind of her experience being a minority at an elite private school full of rich jerks. So Kendra begins going to Taft during her sophomore year of high school, and she shares her initial naivety to the microaggressions that other students exhibit towards her, because Kendra in her hometown, she had a very like diverse friend group, and she came up from an affluent background. Her parents were both very like well-established people, and then this is really Kendra's first time meeting some scholarship kids who are minorities, and then they kind of like expose Kendra to like, hey, people are talking to you crazy, they're showing a lot of microaggressions, and you shouldn't put up with that. So I had really good insights throughout the story. I don't think Kendra said anything like outrageous or at any time tried to make herself or others victims when they, weren't. I think that everything she said was like very fair and very accurate, but a lot of the times the story did get bogged down with Kendra just explaining how weird she was whenever she was in high school. She was like basically like your typical like hot topic kid seeking attention, so sometimes the stories just became a little bit too much and kind of detracted away from her point. The 11th book that I read was another thriller. Of course, you got to read a lot of thrillers during October, and that is Then She Was Gone by Jewell. And I've heard so much about this book, and I'm really glad I read it. I ended up giving it a 3.25 out of 5. This was another one that it took me literally a day to read. I just didn't want to put it down. Basically, what happens in the story is about Laurel. Laurel's daughter Ellie went missing when she was 15 years old, and Laurel completely crumbles for the next decade. They're searching for Ellie. She's just a missing person for a really long time, and even though Laurel has 2 other children, like Ellie was secretly always her favorite, so it just hit her really hard, and she kind of like neglects her husband and her other 2 kids because she just finds herself in this really sad spiral. So Ellie is seen as a runaway until like a decade later, when they end up discovering Ellie's backpack and Ellie, and that she's dead. And Laurel tries to move on. She's now divorced. She starts dating a new guy named Floyd, and she notices that Floyd's young daughter looks pretty much just like Ellie did when Ellie was that age. And it really takes her by surprise, and she's trying to like calm herself down because she knows she's been fixated on Ellie and Ellie's murder for years, but she's like, your daughter looks and acts just like my daughter did, this is really hard for me. So there's really no mystery or suspense in this story, because the way that Jewell laid it out is she kind of tells you what's going on. So there's not a lot of like guessing, and what there is to guess, you can guess pretty easily. You do, of course, have to suspend reality. So despite it being not like one that's going to keep you on like the edge of your seat, I did think that the writing was really good, and it did make me want to keep reading, just because I was like, what crazy thing is going to happen next? The 12th book that I read was a reread. I probably read this originally like almost a decade ago, and this book is called Sharp Objects, and this is by Gillian Flynn. This is the same author of Gone Girl, which is probably my favorite thriller ever. This one was her very first novel, and I didn't really care for it. It's definitely like a dark thriller, a lot of trigger warnings. So I ended up giving this one a 3 out of 5. Like, I'm not mad that I reread it. I remembered a lot of what happened from when I originally read it, but there was a lot that I was like, oh, okay, I didn't quite remember that. So this is about Camille. Camille's a Chicago reporter, and she ends up returning to her hometown to investigate the murder of 2 young girls. Camille ends up having to confront her past, which includes her overbearing mom, the memory of her sister who died whenever she was a kid, and then she also has a little half-sister who she barely knows, and this little half-sister is like 12, but she's like running the town. She's very sexual, and Camille's like, whoa now. So it was really predictable throughout the story. You could guess who the murderer is, and then also some other things as well. I think for a first thriller novel though, it was really commendable. It just was a little bit too dark and too slow for what I like. And I think it was also overwritten in a lot of places. So just, it was okay. The 13th book that I read was called The Family. This is by Naomi Krupitsky, and I gave this one a 2.75 out of 5. This was a read with Jenna pick, which those book club picks are like very hit or miss. This is about a mafia family. So it follows a decades-long journey of 2 daughters of men who are in the mafia. It's historical fiction. And basically the differences between the 2 daughters, one of the daughters is really shy, and then one of them's like super outspoken, and then also their fathers are very different as well, their involvement in the mob or the family. So it was a lot of tell in this book, not a lot of show, and at times it was just like ridiculously boring. Nothing really happened until like the last 30% of the book, and the characters were very generic, very much so like cardboard cutouts put into a box, like, okay, you're gonna be the really strong outspoken one, and you're gonna be the one that follows the straight and narrow path, and like that was their identity pretty much. So that could be a little bit frustrating at times, and the ending of this book was a huge letdown. It was just very rushed, and I don't think that it concluded very well. There was a lot of questions that I still had at the end, like about what's gonna happen to them next. So I don't know. It wasn't bad. I just probably wouldn't recommend that you read it. 13 was a book club pick. I have a book club with my friends in real life, and we decided to read A Haunting in Venice, also known as Halloween Party, by Agatha Christie. This is my first Agatha Christie book that I've ever read. And this one was really disappointing. I ended up giving this a 1 out of 5. One of my friends, before we had read this book, he is a big Agatha Christie fan. He hasn't read all of her books, but the ones he has read, he's like, she's one of my favorite authors. And I'm like notoriously like the most picky reader in our book club. I'm the one that was like, it was okay, while everyone else was like 5 out of 5 stars. So he was like, Madison, I don't know if we can be friends if you don't like this book. So I felt really bad. I texted and I was like, guys, I'm really sorry, but is this one of the most boring books that you've ever read? And then he texted back and he was like, no, this book is not good. I'm so sorry. Like, you'll have to give Agatha Christie another chance. I swear this isn't indicative of how she normally is. So I told him I definitely would try another Agatha Christie book, but this one in particular was just not very good. It does follow her, like one of her most famous character, Hercule Poirot, and it's about him solving a murder of a girl who was murdered at a Halloween party, and it was just like 300 pages of me being really bored. Like nothing happens until the very end. Like I feel like it was just a bunch of dialogue. I don't know if Agatha Christie was just collecting a check at that point. This is like her, I want to say like her 30th Hercule Poirot novel, so maybe she's just bored. But it wasn't good. I heard the movie is completely different though. The 15th book I read is a self-published book, which I like to support like indie self-published authors. So I am glad I read this, even though it wasn't one of my favorites. And this book is called The Night I Spent with Aubrey Fisher. This is by Christopher Tantillo, and I ended up giving this a 2 out of 5. This is young adult, but it does deal with a lot of really heavy issues, so you might want to look up some trigger warnings. So it starts with their main character, Grayson. You find out that Grayson's brother died in an accident, and Grayson has a lot of survivor's guilt from that accident. Because of that accident, Grayson has started shoving away all of his friends, including a girlfriend that he's had basically forever. And he has a plan to kill himself. By the end of the night, he just doesn't want to go on anymore. He feels like he's a burden to his family and to his friends, and that he's just kind of lost all sense of self and self-worth. So before he can go through with his plan, a mysterious kind of like manic pixie dream girl who's new to the school named Aubrey Fisher comes out of the woodwork and is like, spend the day with me, Grayson. And they go on an adventure together. It kind of reminded me of like Nick and Nora's like Infinite playlists and just like how they go on adventures. It's a little John Green-esque as well, but the adventures that they go on are just like really boring at times and just really cliched, and I didn't like Aubrey at all. She was such a cliche. She's like a foster kid and she's got this horrible reputation and she just does these outlandish things and she has a really sad backstory. It just, I think every single character pretty much was super cliched. Both Aubrey and Grayson were like very insufferable. I didn't think they had a lot of redeeming factors. And I didn't really like, Grayson has a best friend in the story and he just makes a lot of really annoying comments throughout. Not very likable characters in my opinion. The friend's name is Reefer and the way he talks about women was gross. And there also was like this instant love, manic pixie dream girl type of trope, which is like one of my least favorites. Even when I was in high school, like I never personally found myself in instant love. Like I had crushes really easily, but like instant love, like I'm gonna spend the rest of my life with you declarations after knowing someone for like 5 hours is just so cringy to me. Ugh, yuck. And the 16th and final book that I did read this month was called The Younger Wife by Sally Hepworth. This is on Kindle Unlimited and this is another thriller. This is one that I gave 3 out of 5. I really like Sally Hepworth. Her books always are just like fast-paced good time. So I read this one really quickly. This is about Tully and Rachel. Their dad is getting married to a much younger woman. It's going to be his second marriage. Now the mom is still his original wife, Tully and Rachel's mom. She's still alive, but she has dementia, and so the dad ends up divorcing the mom with dementia and is now going to marry this much younger woman named Heather. So Heather notices that she's beginning to have a lot of accidents around the dad, Stephen, and she's wondering, like, is she imagining these things? Is Stephen, you know, playing a hand in these clumsy accidents? Like, is there more to Stephen than what meets the eye? And then Rachel, one of the daughters, also discovers a mysterious bottle full of money that the mom who had dementia had been collecting. And so she's like, what's the deal with this? Was mom planning to run away from dad? Because dad like kept a pretty strict hand on the finances. So you're kind of the entire time like on the edge of your seat trying to decide, is the dad Stephen a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Like, are we being gaslit? Like, what's the deal here? And it had a really lame ending in my opinion. It was pretty predictable throughout, but much like Lisa Jewell's writing, there's something just very endearing that wants you to keep reading, and it's very engaging and fast-paced. So if you're just looking for something to read like in a sitting, I think that both Sally Hepworth and Lisa Jewell are really good authors for that. So that was my entire month of October and all of the things I read. Let me know down below, what are some books that you read in October? Let me know, did you have any 5-star reads? And if you did enjoy this video, please do make sure that you do hit the thumbs up and the subscribe button. I'll see you guys next video. Bye.